Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the discussion, American Bases in Australia. Too close for comfort, more of them. More important, binding us tightly, and we're still a target. Our speakers on this subject are Richard Tanter, who's a Senior Research Associate of the Nautilus Institute and Professor, School of Political and Social Studies at the University of Melbourne. From 1989 to 2003, Richard was Professor of International Relations in the School of Environment and Social Studies at Kyoto Seika, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Seika University in Japan. Richard has worked on peace, security, and environmental issues in the East and Southeast Asia as an analyst, policy advocate, and activist since the 1970s. His research has focused on militarization and peace issues in Indonesia, Korea, and Japan, as well as the wider politics of East and Southeast Asia. In East Asia, he has written on questions of Japanese security policy, its intersection with the U.S. policy, and relations with China. The issues of Japanese missile defense and electronic intelligence capabilities, and the possibilities of Japanese acquisition of nuclear weapons. More recently, he has been working with Nautilus colleagues and research partners on theoretical and policy aspects of nuclear extended deterrence in East Asia and the Pacific, nuclear energy issues in East and Southeast Asia, and Australian defense and foreign policy. Richard is also a frequent commentator on international affairs in newspapers, radio, and television, and has been quoted in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, the ABC, BBC, VOA, Al Jazeera, The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, and the Australian Straits Times and Pravda.
I've been away in Japan for a long time and then working for a small organisation called Nautilus, and I find myself 35 years after I left it back at Melbourne University with a desk in the attic, no salary, but doing a bit of teaching. One of the things that was really extraordinary about coming back to Australia, particularly after being in Japan for a long time, where there are some cultural differences, is that in academic life in Australia now, you're required to explain how you are the best in the world, and how you are peerless compared with your competitors, how your university is the best in the world. In other words, behave in the way that if your mother didn't knock it out of it, the kids in the sandpit knocked it out of you when you were 7 years old. It's one of the sort of disgraceful things about academic life. One of the things that was not on that list was my rat bag history, which is probably longer, which goes back to Timor days, but particularly also to involvement in the establishment of People for Nuclear Disarmament in Melbourne, and then convening it for a long time. And indeed, the demonstrations at Pine Gap, Dennis and I were probably going over different parts of the fence at the same time there. I want to talk about four things very quickly. Firstly, what bases are we talking about? The second then is what are the important ones actually do, and then why does this matter? And then say a little bit about what's to be done. I want to start with something that Dennis said about Malcolm Fraser. I worked with Malcolm for the last 4 years, and particularly on what became Dangerous Allies. And it was indeed remarkable to be dealing with someone who, of course, through the 1970s and early 1980s, I quite genuinely hated for a number of reasons. You can imagine some of the conversations that we had about that. But he was remarkable, and one of the interesting things about Malcolm, which came to me after his death, which was completely unexpected. I'm surrounded by people. I'm 65. I've got many people who are around me who are older than Malcolm was, and you worry about them passing. But one of the things about Malcolm was that never once in 4 years of working together crossed my mind that he might die. Not that in the sense that he was immortal, but rather because almost every conversation was about, well, what are we going to do about it, Richard? What are we going to do next? We've done this, how does it move on? And that's, I hope I'm that good when I'm 84, I have to say. But it was one of the remarkable things about him. The other thing which was important was raised by a number of things that Dennis said, which is to take seriously that last book that he wrote, Dangerous Allies. His original title, the original thought was to write a book about Australian independence, arguing that there had never been an independent Australia. We're not independent yet, and we certainly weren't, Gallipoli, putting it mildly. But that was very much his stress, and hence there's a book about history as well as about the present. And on a slightly different note, I am involved with a group called ICAN, International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. And so one of our people is over in New York at the moment at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. They have one every 5 to 10 years. And the Australians issued their statement about, well, nuclear weapons are not very nice, but, well, we rely on extended nuclear deterrence from the Americans. And I then read a statement by the Austrian ambassador to the United Nations, which was, to this disarmament conference, which reminded me of absolutely how deeply non-sovereign, non-independent Australia is. Austria, which is a pretty tiny country, famous for zithers and chocolate as far as I'm concerned, which managed to raise a whole huge range of issues, particularly concerning the behaviour of the United States. They didn't call it that, but it was pretty clear that's what they meant. Which made it clear what the Australians were not talking about. And I have to say that when I was reading this statement from Ambassador Julian Bird for the Australians, it was just deeply shaming to realise, even in something pretty innocuous actually, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference doesn't change much, but even there we couldn't get up and say anything serious. And I very much thought of what Fraser was talking about the need for Australia at long last, finally, 200 plus years of European invasion plus, to actually try and think about what it might mean to be a sovereign country. So, what bases? There's a long list, and we can think about those. Dennis talked about a great many of them. I like to think about bases in Australia in a particular way. Stephen Smith was very fond when he was Labor Minister for Defence, reminding people, wash your mouth out with soap. There are no American bases in Australia. We have joint facilities, I'll have you know. And it's a wonder he was able to say it with a straight face. Indeed, it's true, there are no purely American bases in Australia. There were a few a long time ago, and they were legally American bases, but there aren't any more. What we have is varieties and degrees of jointness, and you can think about it in three ways. We have some American bases to which the United States has access, and there's a long list, and many of the ones that Dennis talked about are on that list. Certainly the airfields up in the top of the country, RAAF Tyndall and Katherine, Sherga up in the top of Queensland. A number of others, a large number of others, are ones where there are particular units or particular embedded American units or groups of people on interim basis, on an intermittent basis. But they're basically Australian bases to which, yeah, okay, the Americans get some access there. So RAAF Tyndall, RAAF Darwin, Coonawarra and Darwin, Bradshaw Field Training Area, which was up in that circle there. Mount Bundy training area further north. At the moment there are 1,150 American Marines in Darwin on what our government calls a rotational basis. The Americans, I guess it's power, allows them to be more honest. They don't give a shit about what anyone else thinks. They make it clear it's permanent rotation as far as they're concerned. They're probably aware that our government is not, that you can't actually do a lot with heavy machinery in the Northern Territory in the wet season, so they only come for 6 months of the year. It's permanent rotation. We have 1,150 Marines there now. This time they brought very heavy helicopter equipment with them. This is part of planning to get up to a full Marine Expeditionary Force, which is exactly what it says, something that can operate on its own. There's then the Delamere weapons range, air weapons range. That's about the size of Cyprus. It's big. And the Americans love it because there's nothing like it west of California and Oregon. There's a whole lot of others that you can talk about, but they're essentially Australian bases. And then there's another set of bases which are really places where the Americans and the Australians are really co-located beside each other. The best example of that is if you go to Perth there on that map and go about 100 k's up the Western Australian coast, you'll come to Geraldton, and then 20 k's inland from Geraldton there's a place called Codgerina, a sheep farming area, and that's where the Australian Defence Satellite Communication Station is. Defence Satellite Communication Station. It's been a big spying place for Australia for about 30 years. It's where we have a number of big antennas inside radomes, and they are pointing at a number of communication satellites sitting over the equator, broadcasting communications for any number of countries, and also a number of military satellites as well. So we listen, well, of course we share their information with the United States. But in recent years, particularly as a result of agreements entered into by the Labor government, particularly by Joel Fitzgibbon and Stephen Smith, we now have 3 separate new parts of the Australian Defence Satellite Communication Station, which are effectively American. Australians can go in there, but the Americans call it the US-Australian compound, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later on. So, co-located. And then there's the ones which are more serious, more important, which are essentially American bases, straight out, in which Australia has a role. And the 2 important ones of those are Pine Gap, which is in Central Australia, just outside Alice Springs, and North West Cape. And if you go up the coast of Western Australia, and you'll see those 2 bits sticking out, yeah, up there, Exmouth Gulf and North West Cape there. I'll talk about them in a minute, but they are essentially American bases to which Australia has access. They're very different. The definition of an American base, I reckon, is if it was built by the Americans, paid for by the Americans, and only operates in conjunction with American global military technology, doesn't matter what it says on the gate. It's an American base that we can go into from time to time under certain restrictions. So that's the first thing to talk about. So I'm actually going to talk about the short list. Dennis quite rightly pointed to the long list that we can look at. I'm going to talk about Pine Gap, North West Cape, and Codgerina, the Australian Defence Satellite Communication Station. All this has become much more important. Those bases, in one way or another, have been around for a long time. What's really important is to understand not just the bases themselves, but the way in which they're now embedded in a completely transformed military relationship with the United States. It's essentially a wired alliance, a networked alliance, if you like. And wired is actually the right word. Those field training areas there, the Eastern Range and the Northern Range, are hardwired. So when the bombs drop, the sensors can tell you whether you hit your target or not. And then the information is sent down here to Bungendore, outside Canberra, to our command officers there. It's also then sent across to Pacific Command on Hawaii, and then further on to parts of the United States. We're hardwired even in that sense. So that's really important. That sense of integration is important. There are now large numbers of Australian Defence Force personnel serving in American units. They're there not just for a short time, but for a long time. And that goes from Major General right the way down. And we have people in American installations in Qatar, we have them in Hawaii, we have them in Colorado. That was not true, actually, going back to, say, Malcolm Fraser's day as Minister for Defence. We may have been allies, but we weren't embedded in the same way. And that's changed the role of Pine Gap, North West Cape and Codgerina. So why this? To give you another example, another part of it, I'm going to argue that this is very important, not just for the grand strategic issues of nuclear war, which it certainly is, but it's very much involved in the wars that Australia is fighting with the United States in the Middle East. And recall, we have had 4 wars with the United States in the Middle East since 1990. Iraq 1, aka the Gulf War, Afghanistan, which is still going on today. Forget about notions of drawdown, we've still got a large number of special forces there. Iraq 2, which lasted from 2003 through to 2010, and now we've got Iraq 4. We had Major General Jim Molan very proud of the fact that he was the Deputy Commander of Allied forces in Iraq. I might have thought that was rather shameful, actually. It comes close to the idea of being a mercenary, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe he didn't think of it that way. Certainly there are issues about the way forces under his command behave, which raise fairly serious issues about crimes in war. And I'll come back again to crimes in war when we talk about Pine Gap. So the networked alliance. I think this is really, really important now to understand that a number of things have changed, that we are really thinking about the ways in which the bases are connected not just to American nuclear operations and nuclear planning, but they're also connected to American conventional operations. And one of the things which is important to understand is that nuclear and conventional warfare, as far as the American is concerned, it's got much closer together conceptually and in the way it's operated before. Pine Gap's involved in providing targeting information which leads to drone assassinations. There are a number of legal cases pending in Britain. There are some which are still being developed in Australia and the United States, basically raising the question, is it not the case that if we are supplying information which makes possible what the lawyers mostly call extrajudicial killing in countries with which we are not at war? We are at war in Afghanistan. There's a little piece of paper from a puppet government inviting us in there, but not in Pakistan, not in the Yemen, and not in Somalia. Pine Gap is clearly, as far as I'm concerned, and clearly I'm no lawyer, we are involved in criminal activities there. And that's going to come back and bite us very hard sooner or later. It's also involved in missile defence, and in particular the missile defence of Japan. And if you've been watching a little bit of that rabid nationalist Prime Minister Abe, this is the most nationalist government Japan has had since the end of the Second World War, and he's a real hawk about these things. We are in very serious trouble of being dragged into, likelihood of being dragged into a war there. I'll come back to other matters about China in a moment. So, that's the short list. The question is, what do they do? Pine Gap. Pine Gap, it's important to understand, and it's really important not to get it wrong because we get hammered if we screw it up by the right wing and the Australian and people like that. It's got two completely separate systems. One which has been there from the beginning, which is what the military calls signals intelligence. Basically, there are a set of about half a dozen very large, very powerful American satellites which are sitting in what's called geostationary orbit. That's about 36,000 k's up. Most satellites are about 800 k's. These are way out there. They're moving at the same angular speed as the Earth's rotation, so they appear to stay over one part of the Earth as we revolve each day. The signals intelligence satellites have got very, very large antennas. They've got single antennas more than 100 metres across. 100 metres is a big antenna. And this is to pick up very weak signals from the Earth's surface. And they also have a cluster of a whole lot of more specialised small ones. And they are listening originally back in 1962 when this was first conceived, and 66 and 67 when it first started operating. They were planned to listen to Soviet radio signals when they were from their missiles as they were testing them, sending messages back to their base automatically saying, this is the temperature of the engine, this is how much fuel I consume, I'm turning in this direction, and so on. CIA analysts getting that data through Pine Gap from those big satellites, that were sort of picked up by the satellites up here, then downlinked to Pine Gap. That enabled them to work out what those Soviet missiles were actually capable of doing. Okay, that's what they did then. Now they can do that, not just for the former Soviet Union, for Russia, for China, for Japan, for South Korea, for North Korea, for Pakistan, for India, countries like Malaysia which are playing with this stuff. They listen to all of those. Okay, it's a big bad world out there, you might want to argue about that. They can also do a great deal more. They pick up radar signals that allows the military to work out, well, if we're going to attack this place, what kind of radar reception we're going to get and how we're going to get around it. They also pick up a great many microwave stations. Most microwave and transmissions, think of the cell towers from your phones around here. You know, you've got your smartphone, it's communicating with something about 2 k's away probably, and then it's zipped off. That stuff which is zipped off goes out through the atmosphere, and if you've got your satellite in the right place, you're going to pick up an awful lot of cell phone material. That's what they're picking up from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Yemen and Somalia, and then they're turning that information into something which is then usable by the targeting people. It's very important. That's signals intelligence, immensely important. The serious intelligence people will say this is the stuff that tells you what's going on, much more than notions about human spying. The second part of Pine Gap only started in 2000. They came, as Dennis was saying, from Narungga, after Narungga, which was near Woomera, was closed down. And this part actually operates remotely. It's operated remotely from Colorado, from Buckley Air Force Base. There are probably half a dozen people actually there on the ground all the time dealing with this, of the 800 or so at Pine Gap. The rest of them are signals intelligence people. But what it does is it's a downlink station. There are similarly a number of about 5 from memory. I can't remember now, sorry. Can't remember how many operational. 5 very large satellites, again in geostationary orbit, sitting over part of the Earth's surface, usually over the equator, sometimes a little bit off it. And on board them there are telescopes, very large, very powerful telescopes, which are operating in the infrared spectrum, not the visible part. They're looking initially for the heat blooms of the launches of missiles. And this was originally part of the early warning system of the United States. In the old Cold War days, whatever would give the United States perhaps that 15 minutes warning to make the decision about whether they're going to incinerate the rest of the Earth or not. Nowadays, it still does that, and of course it's a more complicated nuclear and missile world out there, but they also do a great deal more. They've always done one thing, that early warning has always had, well, it's defensive, isn't it? We don't want to be attacked, that's not unreasonable, okay. The other side of that is, think about this. If, let's say, China launches an attack against the United States, okay, Pine Gap sees that happening, it warns the Americans will prepare their second strike, and that same information will say, in a given part of China, where there are 10 missile silos, okay, numbers 1, 3, 7 and 8 have fired. So don't target them, target 2, 5, 10, whatever it is. In other words, it's assisting the process of nuclear second strike. It always has. Now it does much more than that. One thing it does is assist with missile defence. Missile defence goes back to the Reagan days, but it's basically the idea that if a missile is being launched towards the United States will launch a missile from a ship or from on land, which will actually physically hit that missile in space. That's a really difficult technological thing to do, but they're actually getting fairly close to being able to do it. One of the problems is, how the hell do you find the missile coming towards you? It's a big sky up there, 15,000 kilometres between North Korea and America, for example. Pine Gap does it by picking up almost immediately the peak bloom of the launch, and then calculating from that very rapidly the likely trajectory, and then cueing the missile defence destroyers and land-based missiles in the middle of, or in Japan, Alaska and in the Western Pacific, and same to the radars which they have, which are very powerful. If you looked at that very little bit of sky up there in about 7 seconds, you've got a very good chance of picking up the trajectory of that missile, and then you've got a chance of hitting it. At the moment, without that Pine Gap cueing, they haven't got a hope in hell. In other words, Pine Gap is cued into the defence of Japan and to the missile defence ultimately of the United States. It might change, they might get better radars in the future. At the moment, that's very, very important. It's also important for what the Americans call battlefield awareness. Nice phrase, isn't it? Basically, what the hell is happening on the ground in Afghanistan or Iraq. If it's exploding, if it's hot, if it's a jet, if it's a bomb going off, you can probably see it through those satellites. That's Pine Gap, pretty bloody important, and important not just for nuclear planning and nuclear war, but also for ongoing conventional war. Northwest Cape. Northwest Cape was built in the early 1960s for one purpose: huge, very, very tall masts carrying wires about 1,000 feet up, which were making an antenna system for a very low frequency radio communication system. Then it had one purpose, which was to communicate to submerged American submarines. Very low frequency radio waves can penetrate seawater to about 60 metres or so. And that was important because they were the missile submarines the United States was relying on then. Technology changed. Basically, they didn't need the missile submarines in our part of the world. They're in the deep parts of the Pacific these days. Pine Gap became less important. It was turned over to Australia and to the Australian Navy in the 90s. It's back again with a vengeance. The Americans are back in the submarine communication business again, probably because of their attack submarines they want to use vis-a-vis China in the Indian Ocean, possibly the Persian Gulf. More importantly, under the Labor government, 2 new agreements were signed which opened up 2 quite new facilities at Northwest Cape. One which is almost in place now, which is a space radar, a very big radar station from the old Cape Canaveral rocket range from the island of Antigua, which is going to be turned up into the sky to look for Chinese, Russian, but particularly Chinese satellites. This is basically, it's called space object identification. What the hell is it? What is it doing? How do we predict where it's going to be when we want to hit it? It also has the virtue of finding what's called space junk. Remember the film Gravity, where George Clooney and what's her name were being, bopped on the head and chopped up by exploding Chinese space junk? That's a problem. We all want to watch our YouTube, so that's a good global good. That's not really what it's there for, though, and it's controlled by US Space Operations Command. Yeah. Okay. There's also going to be a space telescope to do the most advanced one in the world, developed by the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, to do the same sort of thing. Northwest Cape is important again. Codgerina, going back to that base, the Australian Defence Satellite Communication Station, that part's still there, we're still spying, part of the Five Eyes, the UK-USA agreements that go back to the Second World War that Dennis mentioned. But there are 2 new parts, in fact 3. One of them is called Wideband Global Satellite System. That's basically, if you have a drone and you're drop-down linking massive amounts of video material and you need this to operate some dreadful thing in Afghanistan or Iraq, you need basically a big pipe to get it down. That's what the Wideband Global System station at Codgerina is going to do in the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asian region. There's also a thing called, goes by the name MUOS, you don't need to know what that means. It's basically a military smartphone which, like the smartest of phones on the markets now, will allow people in the field under all sorts of conditions, not just to dial up home, how are you honey, but rather to dial into the Pentagon and to the Defence Intelligence Agency's most detailed computers where all that data is kept. And this is the network warfare approach. It's really very important. We paid about $1 billion to buy one of 10 wideband global satellite system satellites. We get access to the whole system. The ADF thinks this is great when you go off to Afghanistan or even the Solomons, like that. Malcolm Fraser was nasty enough to ask the question, that's all very well, Richard, for the ADF, but what happens if we want to do something, go to war in a way the Americans don't approve of? Can they cut us off? In other words, is there an ADF communication system which will go bung if the Americans don't like it? Now, I don't know how they do it, but I'm pretty clear that they can do that if they want. And this question then of autonomy and the alliance is really important. The integration into American operations is really there all the way through. We've been pulled into it, we've jumped into it. It's now a cultural thing inside the ADF. A lot of careers being built out of this stuff. Secondly, this is important because Pine Gap in particular is a target. It was a target throughout the Cold War. More than ever, it's important to China. I can go talk more about that later on. And more importantly, Pine Gap will now, an attack on Pine Gap will now kill many more people than it would even when we were going over the walls in the late 80s. There's a big change in Alice Springs there. The Defence Department has admitted this, although they haven't said it publicly. The third thing about its importance is this is really about the issues that Malcolm Fraser has been talking about. Where does Australian sovereignty and responsibility begin and end? Can we, with this hardwired alliance, with this network alliance, is it possible to talk about an independent Australia? The fourth thing is probably where I want to finish, because time's short, and say that I think this is very largely, we have to think about really 2 sets of things that most of us in our political part of the world have not liked to talk about. One is the question of China. Australia as a white occupying nation, occupying Aboriginal land, as a European invasion settler colonial society. We are precisely co-terminus with the time when, in no other time in human history, was China not the centre of the world, civilisationally and politically. That's changed, and clearly there'll be ups and downs in what happens in China now, but the world of certainly my children is going to be one where China is an extraordinarily important country, and where it's going to be challenging American hegemony, because that's what it is, American hegemony in East and Southeast Asia. So I think Hugh White is one of the people who we ought to be looking to, not necessarily because I agree with what Hugh says, but I agree with the questions he's answered. And he's very much questioning why it is that Australia always looks to the United States on these sorts of issues. What's to be done? Very quickly. Firstly, information. Getting the facts out there. They're not that complicated. So, for example, I work with the Medical Association for Prevention of War in Melbourne, and we're producing a series of 2 pages on each of the main bases and getting other stuff out there. Secondly, making it clear to Australians that this is happening and that there are costs attached to it, both financial. We're paying $40 billion for submarines, probably to Japan, without a clue about what they're actually meant to do. Secondly, an awareness that there are alternatives. And the first thing I would say is go back to that really wonderful and important book by a lovely man of the left of the 1980s, David Martin, in his book Armed Neutrality for Australia. David was trying to ask questions which still really need to be asked today. What can we do which is different? Maybe neutrality is not the right word, that had meaning in the Cold War, but certainly an armed and independent Australia may be something that we have to think about, or unless you're a pacifist, which I'm not courageous enough to be, I have to say. Secondly, no nuclear defence of Australia. This is absolutely, absolutely central. This mad stuff that comes out in defence paper after defence white paper saying we rely on American extended nuclear deterrence. Well, firstly, the Americans haven't said it openly that that's the case, whereas they do for other countries. Secondly, what we call extended deterrence for us, we call weapons of mass destruction for other people, so it's obscene. And thirdly, it's strategically reckless. Can you think of a better way of encouraging countries like Indonesia to think they need nuclear protection than us relying on it ourselves? So we need to do something about that. And then there's the question about what do we do about the bases. Dennis has outlined some of these issues. I think it's worth raising issues about whether reform is possible. Is it possible to have some functions of time gap which may assist Australian security, however how we want to interpret it, or is that utterly impossible? Is it only a case of closing it? I think in the end it's a case of closing it, but I actually think there's some things that we can talk about there. And then I think it's a question of how we think about Australia as a defensible country, and we haven't begun to do that. Thanks very much.